I'm Madison.
I'm Chris.
And welcome to the most haunted city on earth. All right, welcome to the first episode of The Most Haunted City on Earth, presented by the Savannah Underground. We are so excited to get started on this. My name is Madison Timmons, along with my co-host,
Chris Soucy. Very nice to meet you all.
Yes. So I guess it's important to start out with kind of talking about what exactly we're doing here. I mean, Chris and I are both paranormal investigators, and we'll introduce ourselves a little bit further. But we're here to talk about Savannah's paranormal, as I like to call it, a lasagna of the damned, if you will. We are a necropolis, so a city of the dead, and we are very closely related to all of our dead still to this day. So we're here to talk about all of those stories and our personal experiences and other things of that nature. So, Chris, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Chris Soucy. I've been a ghost hunter for about 40 years now, and I've been just looking for ghosts all over the world and landed here in Savannah, Georgia, which made it very easy to find ghosts because they are everywhere. And I think one of the most telling things about how haunted a city can be is how much it capitalizes on its hauntings. If by simple per capita the number of ghost tours you have indicates how many ghosts you have, Savannah's got it beat. I don't know any town that has this many active and populated ghost tours. Speaking of ghost tours, our guest here, Eni, I will allow Eni to introduce herself and give us a plug. Plug your stuff.
Oh, God, spotlight. Hi, my name is Enocha Edenfield, Eni to my friends, and I own and operate my own ghost and history tour company here in Savannah, Georgia.
Awesome.
Fantastic.
Well, my name is Madison Timmons, and I am also a paranormal investigator of sorts, but I am a clairvoyant psychic. So essentially, since birth, I've been able to see spirits, and you can imagine how thrilled my parents were about that. But because of that, I kind of leaned into my abilities and started studying spirits and demonology, witchcraft, all of the above. So, and I also have been a ghost tour guide for many, many years at this point. So, yep, that's my experience with the paranormal. So let's go ahead and get started into this little shindig. But
Sure. Absolutely. You know, whenever people come to Savannah, having run ghost tours for years and years, the classic question that everybody has is, what's the most haunted place? Versus what's your favorite haunted place?
Absolutely.
These are oftentimes two totally different things, because the most haunted place may not be your favorite ghost story, may not be the one that, you know, really hooks you. So we will put this question to Eni. We'll start with a simple, what do you think is the most haunted place in Savannah, Georgia?
That's really hard to narrow down.
It's a loaded question.
Yeah, everyone has their own theories, and I feel like certain places are more active at certain times, so it kind of fluctuates. Colonial Park Cemetery is a pretty obvious answer, but it's, I think, a good answer because so many people have had encounters there, even people who are not sensitive in any way. I also have my own TikTok account, which is how the whole tour thing got started. And anytime I do any sort of video on Colonial Park Cemetery, I have so many people in my comments saying, I am not sensitive at all. I walked through the gates and immediately started crying, or I felt like I was being followed. Other people have like the extreme opposite, where they say that they just feel the most at peace in there that they have ever felt. I haven't had any encounters inside Colonial Park Cemetery. My foster dog did, and I had an encounter on the outside of the cemetery. So yeah, I'm gonna go with Colonial Park.
Yeah, I would definitely agree that as far as like most haunted, Colonial Park it ticks all the boxes.
Yes.
Like if you had the sheet of what causes haunting, it all happens in Colonial Park Cemetery: desecration of grave and showing disrespect to the dead, and unfinished business, and all forms of bizarre occurrences. I don't know if you were around. I want to say it was in the early 2000s. There was a mass animal sacrifice in Colonial Park Cemetery.
That was before I moved here.
Yeah, it was about 20 years ago.
One morning, it was like 2003. One morning, a jogger taking the path through, started like coming across chickens, and I think there was even a dog. Just so many animals in one night. And a lot of people were like up in arms about it. And that's actually, it was funny because the park had just reopened for 24 hours. We closed the park at 8 p.m. every night and open it at 8 a.m., mostly because of vandals and mostly because people refuse to respect the dead in the Colonial Park Cemetery. But this was like in a brief period of time when they were like, we can do this, we can open it up. They opened it up, and I want to say it was like a week and a half later, there was this ridiculous event. And many people cited that it coincided with the death of a very popular voodoo practitioner in South Carolina, and people believed that all of this was in honor or in respect or some kind of act, either to seek favor from the recently departed or to seek shelter from the recently departed. But it was very fascinating, and of course, it led to the gates being locked again.
And also for the viewers who may have not been to Savannah, Colonial Park Cemetery is located right between a fire station and a police station. So how no one noticed any of this is kind of an anomaly.
Well, one of the famous ghost stories that they talk about is somebody was in like the early 1900s, possibly late 1800s, a person was beaten to death. And the police station, that first precinct, was always there. It was always, as long as the precinct was there, it was always there, and shared the wall. It actually shares a wall with the cemetery. And so, there is lots of stories about the police responding to calls or patrolling that area on foot. So, yeah, there's a lot of creepies. So, a good call. Good call. Yes,
absolutely.
I think that's true. But it brings us to that second question, which is, what is your favorite ghost story?
My favorite ghost story is probably the Kehoe House.
Oh, yeah, sure.
I love that place, and I did a deep dive into the history of William Kehoe and his family and his business and everything. For the listeners who aren't aware, William Kehoe owned an ironworks company here in Savannah, and he was a very, very wealthy man during his time, and was Irish Catholic, had a whole bunch of kids,
Yes, he did.
and built a home from the ground up off of Columbia Square. And he had a very famous saying, if you can make it out of wood, I can make it out of iron. Yep. And so a lot of the detailing on the exterior and interior of his home are made out of iron. And he lived there until somewhere around 1920 when his wife passed away and his kids had grown up and moved out of the house. He sold the home. It went through several different uses. It was a boarding house. It was a funeral home. It was owned by Joe Namath for a while. Yeah. And then it became an inn. Well, when I first moved here to Savannah in 2010, I heard all the stories that all of us have heard, that the Kehoe twins died in a deadly game of hide and go seek where they climbed up this chimney and died of suffocation. And none of that is true.
No, not even.
And I think the fact that we don't know really who haunts that place is more intriguing than narrowing it down to this mythical origin, because people do still hear children playing in the hallways, even though no children are allowed in that inn.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. I always found that ironic that it's an adults only inn.
And that's another interesting thing is the significance of stories and the kinds of ghost stories, because I have oftentimes noted that we play an interesting game of which came first, the ghost or the ghost story. And sometimes when you encounter something and you need that explanation, that's where stories are born. That's where a lot of the ghost stories that are quickly, denounced, debunked, but endure, because we cannot handle not knowing. Mm-hmm. We cannot handle it just being, and this for anybody who wants to participate in ghost hunting and wants to participate in looking for spirits, there is not an answer for 90% of strange occurrences. Even if you find some line and lineage, even if you find some history that supports it, there is a lot of gray area. But most hauntings are experiential. There are people who see, feel, sense something. And the story is to alleviate the anxiety of the strange occurrence of the thing. And so the twins, I think, is a classic example, because on top of the twin story being, this tragic story of loss, it's ridiculous that two children stuffed themselves in a chimney and died in the chimney. And that was par for the course. If you went on a ghost tour 20, 30 years ago, that was the story you got, was that these two twins hid in a chimney. And that is fascinating because that particular story, the body in the chimney, is such a popular urban legend all across the country. And urban legends are the ones that stick out in your mind as so peculiar, yet quietly believable. So I am more a ghost story hunter than I am a ghost hunter. I am more interested in the stories that people share than the actual haunting that occurs, because I think there's a connection between our personal need to discover and to know, facing the unknown. So it is fascinating.
I think it also helps us unpack our biases and historical biases as well, because William Kehoe, being a very, very proud Catholic man, helped to fund publishing against the Ku Klux Klan. And there's a lot of mixed feelings in Savannah. Savannah was founded as a very Protestant colony, and we have a very huge Irish population and a very huge Irish Catholic population. Yes. So I wonder if maybe the stories that started circulating about the twins dying in the chimney, and how some variations say that it took several days for them to notice that the twins were missing because there were so many children
kids,
in the home. If maybe that was just anti-Catholic rhetoric that seeped its way into it.
Well, there's also a very popular story about Mrs. Kehoe, and her funeral, her wake was held in the parlor, and when they tried to move the coffin out, they say that there was this huge gust of wind and it blew the doors around, and it was basically her refusing to leave, and famously she became the woman in brown, which is a very common ghost anywhere you go in the country. You'll find affluent, rich women who were the heads of households in mansions stay in their mansion. So like if you ever hear about the Lady in Brown, which is, there's a famous photo entitled Lady in Brown, it is almost guaranteed to be a rich, affluential white woman who did not want to leave her house, did not want to leave the mansion. And they're usually cited as very helpful or very, tending to the place and being critical of when people misbehave in the place. So I find that, endlessly fascinating that we also have a habit of sort of putting characters into place that are widely accepted as, popular ghosts. Now let's turn to you, Madison. What is your favorite ghost story?
Okay, well, my favorite ghost story is within the Hampton Lillibridge house. I love that story. Just about, how the house has been murderous for hundreds of years, because of basically it started out with a sailor who was staying in the house when it was acting as a boarding house for weary sailors and whatnot. He commits suicide by hanging in the upstairs bathroom. And then we jump to 1963 and Jim Williams buys the house. And that is when I think kind of hell broke loose in the home historically, with the story, with the contractors coming in and one of them allegedly getting possessed, and he's crawling on the floor and scratching and screaming and whatnot. And then eventually Jim Williams moves into the house, and some people believe that this was the house that made him believe in the paranormal of sorts, but it's always allegedly been a demonic entity within the home. Now, an interesting thing that I've found, I don't know if either of you heard, but I'm sure you've heard of it, Chris, about the coffin found in the basement of the Hampton Lillibridge house. I always thought that was interesting that all of these disastrous incidents were happening inside the home, but there's a coffin with a body inside of it. So obviously something's going to get stirred up when you have a body present. I mean, even when you just have objects that were owned by somebody who's no longer alive, you're sometimes going to get these entities that appear or use them as like a gateway, if you will. So I've always found the Hampton Lillibridge very interesting.
So the classic tale about that and the coffin, because it wasn't a coffin, it was actually a tomb. It was actually, an encasement that was uncovered when they moved the house. They actually, put the house on logs and moved it. And the speculation as to who it was rampant. And, for years we'd hear stories about who they thought it was. A lot of people wanted to go back to pirates because it wasn't that far from the celebrated pirate house, which admittedly probably not as piratey as people want it to be.
Yeah.
But there are other people who wanted it to be Renee Ash Rondelet, who is a wonderful boogeyman in Savannah, Georgia. But he is kind of just that because there's no record of him. There's no way to believe that this was a truth. But it was a story that was told for centuries in Savannah, at the very least a century and a half. But people thought that because, according to legend, and mind you, everything is legend, they had to cut the legs of the person in the coffin because he was too big to fit in the coffin. And famously, Renee Ash Rondelet was supposed to be 7 feet tall. That story and the Hampton Lillibridge house entirely is such a wonderful story because it also famously Jim Williams reached out to have it exorcised.
Yes.
And so there was a priest who went in and performed an exorcism there. And there's, a lot of hullabaloo about it. The current residents have reported absolutely no strange things in the house, save large groups of people standing in front of it going, this is the haunted house. Yes. So it is a wonderful, it's kind of like the Amityville house in a lot of ways.
Just
and
like
it looks like the Amityville house.
It does.
But it has that kind of notoriety for Savannah, this incredible place of speculation, of great supernatural speculation.
Yes. Now, if we're talking about places that I feel are very haunted, I would honestly, I know it's very common to say this, but Wright Square, just because of the sheer amount of nonsense that has gone on in that square. It was a hanging square. It was also a part of the original cemetery. It had the jail. It was like a one-stop shop for the justice system. So, I mean, it was so many people have died in that square. I mean, obviously, most famously, Alice Riley, but she's not the only one.
She was one of many. And the interesting thing, too, is in research, finding where the condemned were buried. That's a big thing because they were not buried in the cemetery, in the proper cemetery. And the interesting thing is there was one document that suggested that it was in the northwestern corner of that square, which is where the CVS sits on Bull and State?
Yes, State Street. Yep.
Bull and State Street. And it's fascinating because that whole row of buildings actually has a pretty wonderfully haunted history of people having bizarre things happening to them. There's an amazing, condominium above the CVS that is always empty. And you're like, well, why is it always empty? It's a prime real estate, but it's always, for lease or for sale. So yes, Wright Square as a ground zero for haunting, it makes perfect sense. That is actually where the bodies that started the Colonial Cemetery came from. They actually dug up all the bodies and moved them over to the site of the Colonial Park Cemetery. And
most of them.
Most of them. Well, I have one of my very first ghost experience in Savannah was in the basement of the building that was the cemetery. And there are corners in that basement that looked like dirt. We had such a horrible time there.
I'm sure.
That's where the original City Lights Theater Company was, York Lane Theater, and I was doing a haunted house, and they opened up and they take us down to the basement, and the basement by itself, you didn't have to scare it up. It had pillars of bricks that looked like Jenga games that people were losing. It was just like this whole building is going to fall on us. And it was this nightmare scenario because it was the entire building, and those buildings take up what serves as a block for Savannah. People who live elsewhere know that Savannah block is not like a block. It's very confusing. But the entire building had just one basement, and it was full of dark corners, and the lights were just that flickering fluorescent bulb light, and you're just like, oh yeah, this is scary. So I was dressed like Michael Myers.
Even better.
The mask and the butcher knife, and my friend was dressed like Jason Voorhees, and we're just in the dark going. but it took us years before we actually realized that that's the site of the cemetery. Like, oh, that explains so much. But yeah, Wright Square is hard to beat when it really comes down to it.
I would agree. Eni, what's probably like one of the most frightening spirit encounters you've had?
So, that's really tough because I guess put up a really good front.
Sure.
I come from a broadcast news background, and as a news producer, when things go terribly, terribly wrong, you have to put on a brave face and pretend like I've got a plan. And I generally do. I have plans A through M ready to go at any point in time. But I've had a couple of encounters that I just was not prepared for, and they threw me off a little bit. And I think the most unnerving was outside of Colonial Park Cemetery. Again, I had wrapped up a tour, and I had left my group over next to Chippewa Square, and I was walking past Colonial Park Cemetery on my way back to the car. And I know all of you have gone past that cemetery at night, and you see like groups of ghost tours, one on top of the other, all out front. Well, I guess I had timed my walk just perfectly because there was no one out there. And so I'm walking on, heading towards the police station, and I feel somebody standing behind me. Well, again, working in news, I know that there's some creeps that hang around downtown, actual flesh and blood creeps. So I turn around fully expecting it to be like a mugger or something, and there is no one there. Absolutely no one. There's no one on the street. There's no one outside of the fire department. There is no one. And I was like, okay, wasn't expecting that. And I had to go back to something that my friend Rebecca, who is also a medium and has also done ghost tours before, she told me that, yeah, sometimes you get some people who try to mess with you, some non-living, breathing people. And you just have to confront them and say, you cannot follow me. You have to stay here. And so that's what I did. I was like, I don't know who you are. I don't care. But you have to stay here. I'm going to keep walking, but you stay here. And I turned around, had my brave face on, and just kept marching forward towards the police department. And whoever it was stayed in that position. I could still feel them behind me, but they got smaller the more I walked away.
That would do it.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's I've heard plenty of people say, I mean, like, I personally have not experienced something on the outside of Colonial Park Cemetery, but I've had people tell me about their experiences like that, where I used to work for another ghost tour company, and one of the drivers, he used to walk his dog past Colonial Park Cemetery every night when he got off work. So he was walking his dog one night, and she's like the most timid little thing in the entire world. But as soon as they hit the corner of Colonial Park Cemetery, the dog just lost it, like uncontrollable, like snarling, like drooling, all of that. And he's like, I've never seen this dog behave that way. And he said there was something in the cemetery that was making that dog really uncomfortable. And because she was like in like guard, like protect dad mode, like this, nothing's going to hurt him, you know. But as soon as they got past the cemetery, dog went totally normal again.
Well, I had a foster dog who reacted to something at Colonial Park as well. I used to foster dogs for Renegade Paws Rescue, and my last foster dog was Xavier. He was a little cutie, absolute snuggle bug, but he had been abused, and so he was really nervous around new people, new sounds, and things like that. So I started walking him downtown to get him used to seeing new people and hearing new sounds, and he was adapting really well. I could never get him used to kids, though. As long as a kid was standing there being calm, he was fine, but the moment the kid started acting like a kid and running around and playing, Xavier was like, that's too much chaos in a tiny body. No. And so one day, he and I were walking downtown by ourselves, and I decided, well, we're going to walk through Colonial Park Cemetery. We get through the back gate, the one next to the playground, and we get just to that sign that has the hours on it, and he sits down, digs his heels in. He is not moving. And I'm trying to coax him forward. Nothing's working. I'm looking around to see if there's somebody doing something weird in the cemetery or if there's a noise I've blocked out. I'm the only person there. And so after a while, I was like, well, obviously this isn't going to work. So I turned him around and we left. Well, a couple of days later, I went back with Xavier and my own dog, Vash, who is a very good big foster brother. And I thought, well, Vash will show him how to walk through here. We get through the gate a little farther than we did last time, and my dog is fine, but Xavier is freaking out. He is reacting to everything. He's very bouncy, very nervous, agitated. And I was like, well, clearly it's not going to work, so we're just going to turn around and leave. And I have a theory, because a lot of people see ghost children playing in Colonial Park Cemetery. I think the ghost children saw Xavier and got excited because there was a dog, and Xavier was like, I can't even deal with living children. No.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you want to hear my crazy story
Yes.
about that? So what's interesting is I've had a lot of experiences in and around Colonial Park Cemetery, but the specific place that you're talking about, I had a friend who lived directly across the street in the row of houses. She had a small apartment on the ground level. Just like if you were standing in front of the Colonial Park Cemetery, there's a bus stop. And if you take like maybe 6 feet away from the bus stop, you're standing directly across the street from her. Well, one night she comes home and she parks right there, and she gets out of her car and she turns and she sees a man in the cemetery, like looking at her, just like she felt absolute menace from this man. And she was like, oh no. And she goes into her house and she kind of like freaks out about it, but weird, not unimaginable. Well, this starts to happen on a regular basis. She sees this guy, she encounters this guy, and she's like, he's not like in colonial wear. He's like in a jean jacket, and he's just a person who's really freaking me out. So she actually asks me to come out, and she worked at the news station, but she did like the 11 o'clock news, so she would get out like well after midnight, and she would ask me to like just be there when she came home, just be in the area. So I like showed up, full baseball bat, and I'm like, yeah, let's go. And I would be there regularly, and for like 2 weeks, I no sign of him. And mind you, I'm a large man with a baseball bat, so if somebody saw me, maybe they would think twice about harassing this woman. So I tell her, I'm sure he's scared off. Don't worry about it. The very next night she comes, I'm not there, and he's on the sidewalk. Mm-mm. But she didn't see him when she pulled up. She got out and she turned, and there he was on the sidewalk. And it just freaked her out, so she runs into her house. And the next day she calls her landlord. She's like, please, 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 I have to break my lease. I have to move. Now, for anybody out there listening, trying to break a lease in Savannah, Georgia is like trying to break a deal with the devil. It is not easy. And she is like, beside herself, and there's no, he's like, maybe you can sublet, maybe you can do this, and then he's like, can I ask what is the reason? And she's kind of crying at this time, and she's like, well, there's this man. And he's like, what was he in the house? Did he break into the house? Are you okay? Are you all right? And she's like, oh no, it's just he's across the street in the cemetery. And the landlord goes, oh, thank goodness. Because the last tenant said he was in the bedroom.
Oh.
And so
Chills.
she moved.
Yeah.
The next day she moved.
Can
And by the way,
imagine.
this is my my evaluation of how haunted a place is. If the person remains in the house, it's not as haunted. But when a person moves immediately, that's a haunting. Because I think that the most telling evidence of a haunting is the effect it has on a person, how they feel. Because she would describe it as just this incredible sense of dread and this incredible sense of threat. So a few years later, I'm talking to, I always called him Popeye, this very leathery old man. And his job was to get the change out of the Savannah Morning News vending machines where they sell newspapers. And I was doing an article on the duel, famous duel, Button Gwinnett's death. Look it up, Google it. I was talking to this guy about that, and he's this crazy man, and he was like, Colonial Park Cemetery. I was like, yeah, I shot a man there once.
Oh.
I was like, excuse me? He's like, yeah, I shot a man there once. He tried to rob me, and I was pulling the change out. I'm pulling the change out. It comes up, and he robs me, gets a bag, and he starts running off, so I shoot him. Because, again, in Savannah, Georgia, the likelihood of the person having a gun is much higher than you would think. Because they may not even look like they have a gun. They've got a gun. So he shoots this guy, and the guy dies. And I was like, you killed a man over a bag of coins? He said, oh, he's a real scumbag. I was like, how do you know? He's like, well, he just came from assaulting a woman right across the street. To which I put all these little pieces in a row, and I was like, I think I know who that was. So I think I know who you encountered on the sidewalk outside of Colonial Park Cemetery. Because it only this spirit also only bothers women.
Well, I appreciate him respecting my boundaries.
Yes,
and
yes.
staying put.
Yes.
Especially after hearing that.
A respectful assailant,
Yes.
It's
Well, and an important thing for anybody who feels haunted or feels that they're encountering something, one of the first and most powerful tools you have is your own conviction. Your spiritual conviction, your ability to turn to a spirit and say no. And it's hard, because if you're scared, it's hard to have conviction. If you're full of dread, it's hard to have conviction. But that is why we have ritual. That's why we came up with talisman and crosses and things that we can use to protect ourselves from spirits. It's because we need that extra boost to give us the conviction we need to turn a spirit away. But if a spirit comes at you and you have enough, energy and power to say, no, stay. That's why and I don't suggest this, but a lot of ghost hunters will carry some form of weapon, a knife or something, because a weapon does embolden you. So like if you've got a knife and you're like, I will cut you, it's kind of ridiculous, but the ghost doesn't know that. The ghost doesn't know that you can't cut it. It exists in a world of intent. And so if your intention is get away from me, if your conviction is strong enough, they will get away from you. They will not bother you. Yeah. And that's not to say that there aren't spirits that have greater convictions than you do. Yeah. It's just the first step is to address it and be direct about how you want it to be handled.
Yeah. I will say one of the most frightening spirits that I have encountered through being a tour guide occurred in the Andrew Lowe House, which I'm sure all of us have been inside the Andrew Lowe House. But I recently actually posted this on TikTok, but there was always these two spirits that I was very suspicious of inside of the house, and that was the little boy spirit and the little girl spirit. There's no reported deaths of these children on the property, which is just weird to begin with, because it's like, why are you here then? And I mean, it's not to say that transient spirits don't exist, of course, but I kind of just chalked it up to being, the Girl Scouts headquarters was in the courtyard. So maybe the girl was a Girl Scout and she just has fond memories. And maybe the boy also just, I don't know, maybe he liked the lights or something. You never know. It's, but what I also always found weird about these two spirits was that they were never in the house at the same time. So, again, didn't really think anything of it. Usually, when I saw it, I was like, okay, whatever. But the thing that made me frightened of this spirit was a guest photo. So I had a woman who was very obnoxious on the tour, which tends to be the target of a lot of spirits, because they can get a reaction out of these people because they're very drunk or they're very extroverted. So this woman was here on her divorce party. So she and her group, her gaggle, were very, very loud and disrespectful to the house, if you will. But towards the end of the house tour, she asked me, can you take my photo? And it happened to be in front of a mirror where we often see spirits. So I take her photo, I take a quick succession of a couple of photos, because, that's the best way to often catch something. Mm-hmm. And so I hand her the phone, and she immediately bursts into like a hysterical scream. And I was like, oh my God, are you okay? and she goes, look at it. And she hands me the phone, and in the mirror, there is a little girl, the little girl that I've always seen, but she looked like she was decaying. And I've never seen her like that before. And then when you swipe to the next photo, she doesn't have a head. So I'm like, okay, well, that's different for this spirit. So then it really gave me a sense of, I don't necessarily want to be around this spirit anymore. Especially because I had started to notice that anytime she or the little boy were in the house, you would get this feeling of you couldn't breathe. I actually had a guest one time on the tour when they were in the house who thought he was having a heart attack, like came running down the stairs where we often see the child spirit, or the children, I guess. He comes running down the stairs, clutching his chest, and he's like, I think I'm having a heart attack. I'm like, oh my God, do I need to call an ambulance? And so I walk him out to the back courtyard, and as soon as he gets out to the courtyard, he's like, I don't feel anything anymore. And so another sign of, okay, the spirit's kind of off. But then I saw it transform in front of me. It went from the little girl spirit to the little boy spirit to something totally different. It was a black figure at the end of it, and it crawled underneath the couch. And I was like, and so I was like, well, that was never human. So that's definitely some kind of other worldly entity. So it bounced around, with ideas of, was it a demonic entity? Was it a trickster spirit? Still kind of hard to decipher, but, Chris actually kind of has a theory of, I think it might have been the same spirit.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, from the sounds of it. And, it's fascinating because I had heard, and this was, maybe the late 90s, early 2000s. I had a friend who was a docent there. And this was before they even did ghost tours. There was a ghost tour that walked through there. And she encountered this child, this girl, and as these things often start, it's a corner of the eye thing. And this is one of the tricks of spirits. The corner of your eye, a lot can happen. If something pops up right in front of you, your brain can quickly denounce it. Even before you have an opportunity to go, what was that? Your brain's like, nope, doesn't exist. I refuse. And creates kind of a blind spot to it. But if it's over here, it piques your interest. It makes you wonder, oh, there's something over there. And you turn to look and it's gone, but it's becoming more and more solid, more and more salient. So in time, it was a little girl that she saw. But it raised all these questions. It made her obsessed. She was obsessed with this little girl. She saw this little girl and she really wanted to know who it was. And she would talk out to it and she would reach out to it and she would basically feed it. Because one of the most potent nutrition to a spirit is human attention. That is why they haunt in a lot of ways. And a lot of times they will come out and be like, boo, and you're like, ah, and that is a smorgasbord. You just fed that spirit. And that's why, they tend to hinge on the scary. Because when you are scared, you are focusing so much. There's a lot of energy in being afraid. You're hyper vigilant. You're listening. You're watching. You're having all these things. So she began to feel drained in any encounter that she had. She began to feel less and less, willing to go out and willing to do things. And in fact, the only thing that she really wanted to do was be in the presence of the spirit. Like go back to the house, go back looking, and what seemed like a obsession suddenly became more like, oh, I think something's got you. I think you're in this symbiotic relationship with whatever it is. And so I posed a hypothesis that what we're dealing with is an anglerfish-like demon or entity utilizing this child's form to draw you in. And you hear this in a lot of ghost stories. There are a lot of ghost stories where people hear like babies crying, or they hear like a woman scream, or somebody pleading for help, or even calling out to their name. What it does is it engages you. It makes you want to seek it out and search it out. And upon the moment of contact, people automatically get hooked. They are consumed by it. And I've seen it many times. People who were perfectly content with not even believing or having, a healthy skepticism. Once they had a real incident, they go all in. Mm-hmm. They become ghost hunters. They buy all the equipment. They do everything. They do that. In a lot of ways, it's just so that they can validate the experience that they had, because otherwise they fear they'll sound crazy. They like, I saw a little kid and it turned into an eagle and flew away. You can't say that. You have to like I always point this question out is like when you all the ghost hunting stories and television shows, a lot of times they will tell you that they got started because of a paranormal event, but they never talk about the event. I don't know any of their personal stories, and I think it's because they still, even after years and years of research, do not want to seem like a fool. They do not want to seem like they were, used their imagination and got away with them. They still want to have this concrete evidence and concrete proof so that it validates that first experience that really scarred them in many ways. So, yes, and one other thing I should mention is, as human beings, we are incredibly responsible for spiritual appearance of other entities. If there's something out there and it is seeking form, it is our mind that makes that form. And I don't mean our imagination. I mean we literally give it form. Like if you see a shadow in the corner and you're like, oh, it's Abraham Lincoln, it will try to be Abraham Lincoln because it's engaging you. Because you are now in a relationship with that spirit and it wants to continue that relationship. It'll do whatever it wants. It'll lie to you. It'll make whatever form makes you pay more attention. And that's why I find it interesting because you're saying a boy and a girl. And I'm like, that's interesting because over the last 20 plus years, people have probably experienced this spirit and ascribed it as a child without gender or quickly flip-flopping in how they're identifying it. So whatever entity it is probably trying to present the spirit that most gives people some kind of connection and connectiveness.
Absolutely. Yeah, and if you do want to see that photo, it is up on our TikTok on the Savannah Underground. So it is very frightening, I must say. So viewer be warned, I guess. But let me ask you, Eni. So with your time of being kind of like a ghost story collector of sorts, have you ever had a guest who gave you a really interesting ghost story?
I've had a few people who have been haunted their entire lives. Some people who have seen spirits their entire lives. And one group told me about a family ghost that they inherited.
Oh.
It was a friend of the family. It was her grandfather's friend. I believe I'm remembering this correctly. And when he passed away, this person's grandfather would still set a place for them at the card table because they used to play cards together. And after the grandfather passed away, people started noticing things around the house that seemed to track with whoever this person was in life. And as the family has, died off, new generations have been born, and even the family members have moved, this ghost seems to tag along. And I think that is creepy, but also kind of sweet in a way, because he doesn't seem to be an annoying ghost. He's just, hanging out.
Yeah, I've always stated that people are more likely to be haunted than houses. I want to say that the primary goal of any spirit is to experience life. And we are alive, and we are the source, and they can vicariously live through us. And so a lot of times people go ghost hunting and don't realize that something attaches to them. And it's so peculiar because there's countless stories where people go into houses and they're like, oh, I have these haunted experiences everywhere I go. And they try to ascribe it to the ghost of the place. But the behavior is always the same. For instance, if a ghost knows your name, it is very unlikely that it's the ghost of, some 1860s, farmhouse. It is likely something that had grown to know you, knows you for whatever reason, and you brought it with you. And now you're in a place where ghosts can communicate. Now you're in a place where obviously, if you go to a haunted place, the environment is very, convenient for a ghost to make itself known. So it can start reaching out. It can start talking to you. It's try to get your attention. And I think some of the most popular or successful ghost hunters don't realize that they're chasing the same ghost everywhere they go. And in my mind, the reason why is because they'll call out the name. That is not normal. Like if I walk into a room and the room is full of people that don't know me, well, why would I expect anyone to look over and say, hey, Chris? why do we think ghosts have that ability? We want to act like ghosts have more knowledge than we do, and the truth is they just have different knowledge, and they shouldn't be able to just divine things out of our brains. That's a different entity. If an entity can see into you, if an entity knows the future, please don't divine, please don't look for the future, because those are entities that have extra human qualities.
Yep.
When I first moved to Savannah, I moved into this really awesome old Victorian house off of East Henry Street. Because, if you're going to move to Savannah, you got to live in the old Victorian house at some point. And it was split into 3 apartments. The first floor was 1 apartment. Second floor was 2 apartments, 1 in the front, 1 in the back. I had the 1 in the back. And the guy who owned the 1 in the front was fantastic neighbor. He was also a ghost tour guide, but he was a photographer as well. And he had lived in that house for a really long time. And so he came over to introduce himself. And one of the first things he asked me was, do you believe in ghosts? And I was like, well, I've lived in the South my entire life. I've seen some things, so sure. And he was like, cool, my apartment's haunted. He might come over to yours, but normally he just stays in mine. I just wanted to give you a heads up in case you had any interactions, but he's cool. And I was like, okay, that's kind of random. And he said he found out because after Hurricane Katrina, it was a medium and her husband who moved into the downstairs apartment. And he said that she brought some of her own ghosts with her. But they were talking one night and she was asking him, do you hear this tapping on your window? Which again, he's on the 2nd floor and there are no trees next to that window. And he was like, yeah, I've heard this tapping. She was like, yeah. So there's this ghost who haunts your apartment. He's a man. She told him the name, which I do not remember. I just call him Bob. And Bob wants you to know that he really likes the color blue. So if you could put like a blue candle or something on the fireplace, just something that he can call his own, he's fine with sharing a space with you. And then later on, she moved out of the house. Her ghost went with her. Bob stayed behind.
That's amazing. Yeah, and that's another thing is if you carry a ghost with you, you might find a place that has a much more compatible energy, and the ghost might stay there, which is, I believe, what happens in Savannah a lot. I think the whole of Savannah is very accommodating to spirits, so people will come from all over the world bringing their ghosts with them, and the ghosts are like, oh, this place. People respect ghosts. People tell ghost stories. People walk in groups of 30 and through every square to hear ghost stories. So this place is my place, and people actually get detached. But in equal parts, that's a detriment to Savannah, spiritually speaking or paranormally speaking. I've known many people, many psychics who have had to go, who just left because it was so oppressive and there was so much attention, and all of a sudden they were just overwhelmed by I had a friend who used to say it was like a black dome was over the city of Savannah. Like you could tell when you passed into that paranormal field of Savannah, you go into it and you sense, oh, there's something stirring. And it's right at the bridge, right when you cross over the Savannah, the Talmud, whatever you want to call it, the bridge. When you go over the bridge, there's a moment at the top of the bridge where you go from being nice and sunny to being gray and gloomy. And I've known a lot of people to suffer from a depression that they'd never had before, a sensation that they never had before. And it's like, you may not realize it, but you're sensitive. You're sensitive to this. I, quite luckily, am not sensitive, but I'm freakishly phobic. So that might be my sensitivity, is that I'm really scared of a lot of things. So I'm quick to know when things are strange or off or bizarre. But this town, there is something about it that, and we talked about the necropolis and the sensation. And I almost think that a part of it is, too, that Savannah refuses its darkness. Even in the most sinister of circumstances, it still puts on the pretty face. It still acts like the hostess city of the South. Meanwhile, there's a lot of blood, and we cover it up. We still cover it up. We still have a hard time learning, like, the extent of violence that happens in Savannah because it's being covered up, possibly for the tourist trade. But more, I think, for vanity. The city has a vanity to it that suggests maybe if I put enough makeup on my face, they'll never notice the scar. And given the tourist trade, it works. We've got an incredibly booming tourist trade because people fall instantly in love with Savannah, and they, it's a romantic city. It woos you, but it has. I always call it Savannah by day and Savannah by night. Savannah by day, one of the most beautiful places you'll ever be. Savannah by night, one of the most terrifying places you'll ever be.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a dark romance that you really get the sensation of when you've lived here for a while, especially. You really get to know all the places that, one of the places I think of in particular is Monterey Square. It always seems to have a fog on it. You know, it just feels like a noir film, but like haunted. So, and I think you're right about we do put up a front of, our history isn't that bad, but we have a lot of death. I mean, if you even think about Colonial Park Cemetery, that extended about a block in every direction. So even when you're not in the cemetery, you're walking on top of dead people.
Absolutely.
So it's like, and then on top of it, we built on top of all of our dead for the most part. We didn't stop progress. We just were like, just stack a building on there.
When I first moved here, Savannah was suffering from daily floods. There was a period of time when you can almost set your clock to it. From April to August, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, it would rain like the end of the world. And in those storms, I think it was 1994, bones started surfacing because the ground had gotten so muddy and mucky. And I'll never forget. And I've looked for this picture many times, but I remember a photograph of a policeman holding like the rib cage of a person. And it was Calhoun Square. It was found in the rain spout, in the rain gutter of Calhoun Square. And it was like, that's insane. And it was like, we should excavate, we should do it. And instead what they did was they put like a mesh or a chain link fence and then put sod on top of that. Because they're like, wow, that'll keep them from popping up. I'm like, okay, great. So, and it comes down to even like servants' quarters. They call them all servants' quarters, but it was slave housing, and we don't talk about slaves, or at least not until I'd say within the last decade has the conversation of slavery in Savannah been a big part of like history tours and things, because it just wasn't. Did you have to take the tour guide's license test? Mm-hmm. Okay, so the tour guide's license test does not cover slavery at all. Nope. There's like maybe a paragraph or two. And the thing that they're always very proud of was that there was a prohibition on slavery when the city but it only lasted 20 years. Yeah. And they brought all the slaves in from South Carolina to work. Yeah. We're literally right across the river. And that prohibition did not last. But we always talk about it because there's a prohibition on liquor, prohibition on spirits, and a prohibition on lawyers. Because all three of those things make people lazy. So it's fascinating because for some reason we like to, because even when we talk about like the Civil War, we discuss, we emancipated slaves before the emancipation population. It's like, that's because you were under siege. You were a city under siege and you couldn't feed yourselves, much less your slaves. Mm-hmm. So you cut them loose in a lot of occasions. So yeah, it was, it's very interesting because Savannah is very good at putting on that pretty face.
Mm-hmm. Got to keep the Southern charm.
Yeah, exactly.
But I do want to say, though, that off of the topic of bones arising, something that I found really interesting was, I don't know if y'all heard about that, but during Hurricane Matthew, they had a lot of the century oaks fall on Liberty Street. So if you visit Savannah, there's a lot of century oaks that are huge and hundreds of years old. Well, when you go on to the west side of Liberty Street, there's a lot of saplings right now. And that is because a lot of those century oaks fell over during Hurricane Matthew. But what they found when they fell over were bones grown into the roots of the trees. And if that doesn't tell you how much you need to know of how many dead people are under this city, that's all you need to know.
One of my favorite stories regarding that was I had a friend who was making a bed and breakfast on Gaston Street. And he's doing heavy renovations on this old house. And he actually pulls down a wall and there's a skeleton in the wall, and it's got a knife in its chest. And he's like, oh, no, oh, no, oh, no. But more than anything, he's like, is this going to interfere with my permit to, finish this renovation? So he actually took the skeleton and put it in the closet. He invited me over and showed me, look at the skeleton. I'm like, oh, God. And he was like, well, once I finish the renovations, I'll call the police. And I was like, oh, I want to be here when the police come. Because I don't know what you do. What do you do with because it was obviously a very old, skeleton. So I come on the day that the police are supposed to arrive. And when the policeman comes, he's, very non-involved. And my friend's like, kind of excited. He's like, wait, did you see this? And he opens the door and he's like, ha ha. And the cop just grabs the skeleton and shoves it in a bag, like a big, gigantic lawn trash bag. And we're like, whoa, 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 don't you want to investigate? Don't you want to, don't you have questions? And he's like, nah. And the guy's like, it had a knife in its chest. And he's like, no, that wasn't a knife. He reaches in and pops this thing out, and he's like, it's a mortar spatula. And my friend's like, what? He's like, oh, yeah, when they were building the house, they probably unearthed a grave, and they just buried it in the wall, and they were using it to hold their tools. They would put the tools.
As you do.
Just
it was a literal
Yes.
tool chest. They put the tools in the ribs. And so my friend's like, do I have to sign anything? Do I, is there a process? And he's like, nah, happens all the time, was his response. Happens all the time. And then he disappears, and me and my friend are just standing in his little lobby going, what?
The cursed tool bag.
I know. It's like, what? And later I would learn that there's actually a body farm. I think it's outside of Macon. And the body farm is a place where police will get bodies in various levels of decay so that they can use it forensically, so that they can cite, how much decay in the bones, how much did the environment affect it, things like that. And that's where these bodies end up, or these bones and things. Because there's no way to trace the bones.
Well, personally, I've never used a body to hold my tools, but,
No, I have a toolbox for that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but what if you didn't?
I do love how many bodies have been found in walls
Yeah.
in Savannah.
Oh, so many. So many.
That's for most people, they're probably like, oh my gosh, that happens like once in a million times. And no.
A lot of people don't realize that families would oftentimes bury their loved ones in their yard, and in Savannah, they're very tight yards. And I've had friends find like tombstones beautifully like inlaid with the wall, with the garden wall. And it's because it's a personal affair, mourning and death and grief. And so it was not uncommon for people. There's a great house right on the corner of Jones and Lincoln that has an amazing slab in it. And I remember people who lived inside the house used to always say that every now and then they would see a woman sitting on a bench, and the bench wasn't even there. Mm-hmm. It was like phantom furniture. But they would see her sitting out there every now and then. Mm-hmm. And I was like, that's really interesting. And then we discovered that slab was indeed to keep coffins in, to keep from the
apparently
wet
that
soil.
was a prevalent practice because the city of Savannah at one point actually passed a law making it illegal to bury your family in your backyard.
That's right.
Yep.
That's right. They had to write it down.
Oh,
They're like,
yes.
okay, people, knock it off.
Oh, yeah. I'm pretty sure the Davenport house also has one of those where there was a woman who was buried out in the back courtyard. And so oftentimes he would go into the rooms, and I believe they called her Mrs. Pickles. I don't know why. I don't think that's her actual name, but that was what they called her.
Sure.
So Mrs. Pickles, she had a particular room that she liked, and the beds are always pristinely done up and whatnot, but you would always see a fresh butt print in the bed in her room that she liked. So, they still hang around even if you do move their graves and whatnot. But with that being said, I do want to say thank you to Eni for coming onto the show with us on our first podcast. So
Thanks for having me.
That's
Absolutely.
wonderful. We'll ask you back.
Yes.
I would love that.
We all know we're chock full of stories.
Yes. If you couldn't tell.
Please pitch or plug your various and sundry goods.
Yes. So you can find me on TikTok, saltwavesspanishmoss. I'm on Instagram at Enocha Edenfield. Eni is spelled E-E-N-I-E. And I also have my own ghost and history tour company. EnochaEdenfieldTours.com.
Awesome.
Yes, absolutely. And if you make your way to Savannah, please take Enie's tour. It's amazing. I follow her. She gives the tours on TikTok, so you can literally follow along with a lot of these tours, but they're wonderful.
But it's fun to do it in person.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Yes. Also, if you do want to watch this recording of the podcast, you can find it on YouTube. You can also find it on Spotify. And if you want to just see various snippets of ghost stories and tales, you can follow us on TikTok at the Savannah Underground. Like I said, you can see the photo there, and we're going to have lots of more creepy ghost content on there. So definitely go ahead and check that out. But thank you guys so much for listening. And this has been Madison Timmons and
Chris Soucy.
And stay spooky, y'all.